Ladies and gentlemen, if you think the right words are what makes someone miss you, you've already been taught the wrong lesson. It's not the long paragraphs, not the late night explanations, not the emotional confessions. It's the calm text, the one sent without fear, the one that doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't explain. That single message that says nothing and yet changes everything. Because when a woman chooses herself, when her words come from confidence instead of desperation, she doesn't just get remembered, she gets replayed in his mind all night. And once that happens, nothing feels the same again. This text makes him think about you all night, not because it begs for attention, not because it asks for validation, but because it carries something far more powerful, certainty. It carries the energy of a woman who knows her worth, who understands that her silence is louder than her words, and whose presence is felt even in absence. You see, the most unforgettable message is not typed with desperation. It's written with self-respect, confidence, and emotional intelligence. It doesn't chase, it doesn't explain, it doesn't justify. It simply exists, calm and composed, leaving the other person to do the thinking. When you send a text from a place of wholeness, it lands differently. It doesn't scream, "Don't leave." It quietly says, "I'll be fine either way." And that is what keeps him awake. Because people are not haunted by those who need them, they are haunted by those who don't. The power lies in restraint, in knowing when to speak and when to let silence finish the sentence for you. A woman who doesn't overtext, who doesn't overreact, who doesn't over-explain, becomes a mystery in a world where everything is available at the tap of a screen. That text isn't long, it isn't dramatic, it doesn't accuse or demand. It might be as simple as honesty wrapped in grace, something that reflects clarity, not chaos, because clarity is intimidating to someone who isn't ready to face their own feelings. When you communicate without fear of losing someone, it forces them to confront the possibility of losing you. And suddenly, your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was. Confidence is not loud, it's grounded. It's knowing that your value does not decrease when someone fails to see it. The text that keeps him thinking all night is one that doesn't ask for reassurance. It doesn't say, "Why didn't you reply?" It doesn't say, "Did I do something wrong?" Instead, it reflects a woman who has a full life, dreams to chase, and standards that don't bend for convenience. That realization unsettles him because it reminds him that you are a choice, not an option. There is something incredibly powerful about emotional discipline, about choosing words carefully, about not reacting impulsively. When you respond with calm instead of chaos, with self-respect instead of insecurity, you disrupt expectations. And disruption sparks curiosity. Curiosity leads to reflection. Reflection leads to sleepless nights wondering, what is she thinking? Why isn't she affected? Why does she seem so at peace? The truth is, when you stop trying to be unforgettable, you become unforgettable. When you stop trying to prove your worth, it shines naturally. That text doesn't try to convince him of anything. It simply reflects your truth. It might acknowledge a situation without bitterness. It might express boundaries without anger. It might even wish well without attachment. And that's what makes it powerful, the lack of emotional bargaining. A woman who knows when to step back instead of stepping down commands attention without asking for it. She understands that her energy is sacred, that her time is valuable, that her emotions are not tools to be used for manipulation, but expressions of authenticity. And when she communicates from that space, every word carries weight, because it's not fueled by fear, it's fueled by self-awareness. People often think attraction is about saying the right thing. But real impact comes from being the right energy. The text that lingers in his mind is not seductive in a shallow way. It's grounded in self-respect. It signals maturity. It shows emotional strength. And emotional strength is rare. It makes people pause. It makes them rethink their actions. It makes them question what they might lose. When you stop overgiving, when you stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you, something shifts. Your words become fewer, but stronger. Your presence becomes calmer, but deeper. That text doesn't say, "I need you." It says, "I value myself." And that's the message that echoes long after the screen goes dark. There's elegance in emotional independence, in not needing constant reassurance to feel secure, in not turning communication into a battlefield. When your words are clean and intentional, they leave no room for confusion, and clarity is confronting. It forces people to meet you at your level or step aside. That realization alone can keep someone awake at night, replaying conversations, rereading messages, searching for hidden meanings that simply reflect your self-assured nature. You don't need to be cold to be powerful. You need to be clear. You don't need to be distant to be respected. You need to be grounded. The most impactful text is one that comes from emotional balance. Not too much, not too little. Just enough to express without attachment. Just enough to communicate without control. And that balance is magnetic. A woman who chooses herself without guilt becomes unforgettable because she doesn't make her world smaller to fit into someone else's uncertainty. She doesn't abandon her standards for attention. She doesn't negotiate her worth. And when she speaks, even briefly, it carries the weight of someone who knows she'll be okay, regardless of the outcome. That's why he thinks about you all night. Not because of what you said, but because of what you didn't say. Because of the calm confidence behind your words. Because of the self-respect that cannot be shaken. Because you reminded him, without trying, that you are not easily replaced, not easily forgotten, and not easily accessed. When your message comes from self-love, it changes the dynamic. It shifts the power back to you. It transforms communication from seeking validation into expressing truth. And truth has a way of lingering, of echoing, of staying long after the conversation ends. The most powerful thing you can ever send is not a perfectly crafted sentence, but the energy of a woman who is complete on her own, who is open but not dependent, kind but not weak, confident but not arrogant. And when that energy flows through your words, they don't just get read, they get felt. That is what makes him think about you all night. The realization that you are not waiting, you are not chasing, you are not trying to be chosen. You already chose yourself. And when a woman chooses herself, the entire dynamic shifts in ways that cannot be ignored. Her energy changes before her words do. She no longer reacts from a place of fear, but responds from a place of knowing. She understands that love is not proven through anxiety and connection is not built through emotional exhaustion. That awareness alone makes her presence powerful because it cannot be controlled, rushed, or manipulated. From that space, every interaction becomes intentional. She is no longer available on demand, not because she wants to punish anyone, but because she values her own rhythm. Her time has meaning, her attention has weight, and when she gives it, it feels earned. That realization can be unsettling to someone who once assumed unlimited access. It forces reflection. It brings awareness to effort, to consistency, to the quiet question of whether they showed up enough. The text that follows this shift doesn't explain the change. It doesn't announce growth. It simply reflects it. The tone is calm. The words are measured. There is no urgency hidden between the lines. And that calm becomes impossible to ignore because calm is not indifference. It is control. Control over emotions, expectations, and self-worth. She understands that not every feeling needs to be shared instantly. Not every thought needs to be sent. Silence, when chosen consciously, becomes a form of communication. It says, I trust myself. It says, I don't need to fill the gaps with noise. And that silence invites imagination. Imagination keeps the mind awake. Wondering replaces certainty, and certainty is comfortable, but wondering is consuming. A woman grounded in herself does not confuse availability with intimacy. She knows that intimacy is built through presence, respect, and mutual effort, not constant messaging. So when she does send a text, it carries clarity instead of confusion. It isn't loaded with expectations. It doesn't seek a reaction. It simply exists as an extension of her stable inner world. That stability is rare, and rarity creates value. When someone realizes they cannot predict you, cannot rush you, cannot access you without intention, they start paying closer attention. They replay conversations, they analyze tone, they search for meaning not because it's hidden, but because they are no longer the center of your emotional universe. Choosing yourself doesn't make you distant. It makes you discerning. You still care, but you don't collapse into that care. You still feel deeply, but you don't bleed emotionally to prove it. And that balance creates intrigue, because depth without desperation feels powerful. It feels secure. It feels like someone who knows they will not lose themselves for connection. The message that lingers is often the one that doesn't ask for clarity but offers it. The one that doesn't demand consistency but embodies it. The one that doesn't seek reassurance but radiates confidence. That energy challenges people to rise or step away, and either choice reveals truth. A woman who has chosen herself does not wait anxiously for replies. She continues living. She invests in her growth, her passions, her goals. Her life doesn't pause for a notification. And that reality can be confronting to someone who once assumed they were the focus, because it reminds them that they are part of her world, not the center of it. This is where respect grows, not forced respect, but earned respect, the kind that comes from witnessing emotional maturity, from seeing someone remain kind without being naive, open without being unguarded, expressive without being needy. That combination is powerful because it cannot be easily labeled or dismissed. When you communicate from this space, your words don't need embellishment. You don't need to sound impressive. Authenticity does the work for you. Even simple sentences carry strength when they come from alignment. And alignment is felt instantly, even through a screen. He thinks about you because you didn't try to control the outcome. You allowed things to be what they are. And surrendering control is not weakness. It's confidence. It says you trust yourself enough to handle any result. That level of self-trust is magnetic. You stop negotiating your needs. You stop softening your boundaries to avoid discomfort. And in doing so, you become clear. Clear people are not easy to manipulate. They are not easy to confuse. And that clarity forces others to confront their own intentions. A woman who chooses herself no longer fears being misunderstood. She knows that the right people will meet her where she stands. And that certainty removes the urge to over-explain. Over-explaining fades away when self-worth becomes solid. The text that follows this evolution feels different because it is different. It doesn't come from emotional hunger, it comes from emotional fullness. And fullness doesn't chase, it attracts. It doesn't plead, it invites. It doesn't cling, it allows. That allowance creates space. Space for someone to step forward or step back. And space is uncomfortable for those who rely on control. They begin to feel the distance not as punishment, but as possibility slipping through their fingers. You become memorable not through effort, but through presence, through consistency in who you are, not who you perform to be. And that authenticity leaves an imprint. It stays, it echoes, it resurfaces in quiet moments, in late nights, in unanswered questions. Choosing yourself also means you are no longer afraid of endings. You understand that what is meant to stay will stay without force. And what requires you to abandon yourself to keep was never aligned. That understanding brings peace. And peace is powerful because it cannot be shaken easily. Your communication reflects that peace. It doesn't rush to resolve discomfort. It doesn't fear pauses. It trusts timing. And when someone feels that, they sense depth. Depth that cannot be faked or replaced quickly. The nights grow quieter on your end, but louder on theirs. Because when you stop carrying emotional weight for two people, the imbalance becomes visible. And visibility leads to awareness. Awareness leads to reflection. You are no longer trying to be unforgettable. You simply are. Not because of strategy, but because of self-respect. Because you chose growth over attachment, clarity over confusion, and self-worth over validation. And in that choice, every word you send, every silence you keep, every boundary you honor continues to speak for you, long after the conversation pauses, long after the screen goes dark, long after the mind begins to wander back to the energy it cannot forget. It keeps returning because energy like that does not disappear once it's felt. It settles into memory, into moments of stillness, into the spaces where distraction fades and honesty surfaces. When a woman moves through life with that kind of inner alignment, she doesn't need to remind anyone of her value. It's already registered deeply and quietly, the way truth always does. She no longer adjusts her tone to be more palatable. She no longer shrinks her needs to avoid being called difficult. She understands that being easy is not the same as being respected. So her words remain steady, not softened by fear, not sharpened by anger. They are firm, graceful, and unapologetically authentic. That authenticity creates a resonance that cannot be shaken by time or distance. There is a shift that happens when someone realizes you are not waiting for them to decide your worth. That realization can feel disorienting because it removes leverage, it removes assumption, it removes the comfort of knowing you will always be there, emotionally available on demand. And once that comfort is gone, reflection begins. Questions arise. What changed? Why does she feel different? Why does her absence feel heavier than her presence ever did? She understands now that attachment without self-respect is a slow erosion of identity. So she chooses connection without self-abandonment. She chooses openness without overexposure. And when she speaks, it is not to secure a place in someone's life, but to express a truth that stands on its own. That truth carries a calm authority, not dominance, not control, but self-possession, the kind that comes from knowing you can walk away and still remain whole. That knowledge changes posture, tone, and timing. It shows up in pauses, in restraint, in the decision not to send a message just to feel something in return. The nights become reflective because there is nothing left to react to, only something to feel. When chaos leaves the conversation, clarity enters the mind. And clarity can be uncomfortable. It highlights what was taken for granted. It reveals moments where effort was minimal, presence was inconsistent, and intentions were unclear. A woman who chooses herself no longer fears being alone. She has made peace with her own company. And peace is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It simply exists. That existence becomes noticeable when it's no longer chasing approval or reassurance, when it stops asking to be seen and simply is. Her messages now feel intentional because they are. They are not sent out of loneliness or longing, but from a place of grounded choice. And choice is powerful. It implies freedom. It implies agency. It implies that every interaction is optional, not necessary for survival. That realization shifts the emotional balance. It removes pressure. It removes urgency. And in doing so, it makes the connection feel more real. Because what is chosen freely carries more weight than what is clung to out of fear. She understands that silence is not rejection. Sometimes it is respect. Respect for her own energy, respect for timing, respect for the process of growth. And when she allows silence without anxiety, it forces others to sit with their own thoughts, to notice what arises in the absence of constant engagement. What arises is often awareness. Awareness of what they felt when she was present. Awareness of how her energy made them feel grounded, challenged, seen. Awareness of how rare it is to encounter someone who does not need to be needed. Needing someone can create intensity, but it does not create depth. Depth comes from mutual choice, from alignment, from two whole individuals meeting without the need to complete each other. And that depth is what lingers. It's what replays in the mind during quiet hours. She has learned that the most powerful thing she can offer is not endless availability, but authenticity. Not emotional labor, but emotional clarity. Not sacrifice, but standards. And those standards do not push people away. They filter. Those who are not ready fall away naturally. Those who are ready step forward with intention. And in that natural sorting, she remains centered, unshaken, because her worth is no longer tied to outcome. Her presence becomes a mirror. It reflects effort or the lack of it. It reflects consistency or inconsistency. And mirrors can be confronting. They don't argue. They don't accuse. They simply show what is. That is why the thought of her returns uninvited, not because she demanded attention, but because she removed herself from the role of pursuer. She allowed space for truth to surface, and truth always finds its way to the surface when noise disappears. She knows now that attraction is not built through intensity alone, but through emotional safety, through predictability in character, not in availability, through the quiet confidence of someone who is not afraid to lose what is not aligned. And when someone senses that level of self-trust, it awakens something in them. Sometimes admiration, sometimes regret, sometimes a desire to rise, sometimes the realization that they may not have shown up fully. The mind keeps circling back to what feels unresolved. And what feels unresolved is often not the conversation, but the awareness that someone stood in their power without needing permission. She doesn't seek closure through words anymore. She finds it through alignment, through the knowledge that she honored herself, that she did not abandon her values to maintain connection, that she remained kind without compromising herself. That integrity is unforgettable. It doesn't fade with time. It doesn't lose impact with distance. It settles into memory as a standard, as a reference point for what emotional maturity feels like. And once someone has experienced that, it becomes difficult to forget because it raises the bar, it shifts expectations, it changes how future connections are measured. She continues moving forward, not hardened but refined, not closed but clear.